Não existe nada mais importante que a educação de nossos filhos. Nós, pais e professores, fizemos este vídeo para que vocês, pais e professores, possam entender o que são as bases curriculares comuns. Em primeiro lugar, vocês devem saber que a Constituição brasileira afirma, em seu artigo 205, que a educação é dever da família. Ainda mais, a Constituição também limita o papel do governo federal na educação. Ela afirma, em seu artigo 22, que em matéria de educação, cabe ao governo federal apenas fornecer as diretrizes e bases da educação nacional. E em seu artigo 210, um conteúdo mínimo para o ensino fundamental. O restante da educação cabe aos diversos sistemas estaduais de ensino e às próprias famílias. E não é só isso. A Lei de Diretrizes e Bases da Educação, em seu artigo 15, preceitua que as escolas sejam assegurados progressivos graus de autonomia, não só administrativa, mas também pedagógica. Em 1998, logo após a aprovação da Lei de Diretrizes e Bases, o Conselho Nacional de Educação debateu o significado dessas expressões. A Câmara de Educação Básica interpretou essas expressões e publicou o parecer técnico número 15 de 1998. O Ministério da Educação assim explicou o que estes termos queriam significar. Diretriz é a linha de orientação, norma de conduta. Base é a superfície de apoio, fundamento. A diretriz indica a direção geral a seguir, não as coisas miúdas do caminho. A base significa o alicerce do edifício, não o próprio edifício que sobre o alicerce será construído. Assim entendidos estes termos, as diretrizes e bases devem conter apenas preceitos genéricos e fundamentais. Quanto à autonomia das escolas, isto é mais que uma diretriz, é um mandamento da lei. Mas agora, contrariamente ao que afirma a Constituição, a Lei de Diretrizes e Bases e a interpretação oficial constante do Ministério da Educação, o governo brasileiro resolveu copiar o mesmo modelo que está sendo imposto nos Estados Unidos. O governo brasileiro está elaborando uma gigantesca e detalhadíssima Base Nacional Comum Curricular. E será ela quem irá decidir, e não mais os estados ou as famílias, o que os alunos irão estudar em todo o Brasil, sobre português, matemática, inglês, artes, geografia, história, ciências, física, química, biologia, etc. Em suma, sobre todas as matérias que compõem o miolo do currículo tradicional. Com a colaboração do Banco Mundial, essa centralização da educação no Brasil iniciou-se, ainda timidamente, durante o governo do presidente Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Mas o próprio ministro da Educação da época, Paulo Renato Souza, que havia imaginado um projeto semelhante às atuais bases nacionais curriculares comuns, impediu seu prosseguimento, declarando que a iniciativa seria inconstitucional. Uma das consequências dessa centralização inconstitucional da educação será o irrefreável caráter doutrinário e ideológico que a educação inevitavelmente passará a ter. Como exemplo dessa ideologização, além de diversos outros conteúdos, a terceira versão das bases, que será aprovada em novembro deste ano de 2017, está recheada de ideologia de gênero. A ideologia de gênero já havia sido rejeitada pelo Senado e pela Câmara, quando em 2014 foi votado o Plano Nacional de Educação. Depois, quando em 2015 foram votados os planos municipais de educação em todo o país, ela foi novamente rejeitada pelos quase 6.000 municípios brasileiros. agora foi reintroduzida pelo MEC na Base Nacional Comum Curricular. Se as famílias não concordarem com este conteúdo ideológico, daqui em diante, elas não terão mais o direito de decidir sobre o que será ensinado aos seus filhos. O governo federal terá tomado a última palavra e o lugar dos pais no que diz respeito à educação de seus filhos. Entre as inúmeras citações à ideologia de gênero presentes na base, fica estabelecido na página 19 da terceira versão que entre as competências gerais da base deverá figurar o exercício da valorização da diversidade, da identidade e do gênero. Na página 165, a base exige que os professores de artes problematizem nas experiências vividas em aula as questões de gênero, corpo e sexualidade. Na área de ciências humanas, a base afirma, na página 305, que a diversidade de gênero deverá ganhar especial destaque, e na página 351, que o professor de História deverá, ao apresentar sua matéria, destacar as temáticas voltadas às questões de gênero. Um processo semelhante de centralização e ideologização do ensino está ocorrendo também nos Estados Unidos, de onde ele está sendo copiado para o Brasil. Assista a seguir alguns vídeos sobre a educação e as mudanças nas bases curriculares comuns americanas e você poderá entender de onde está vindo a ideologização infiltrada no sistema educacional brasileiro. Lembre-se, não existe nada mais importante que a educação de nossos filhos.
The very first American education law was written by the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1647. The Old Deluder Act required that any community, upon reaching a population of 50 families, hire a teacher. When the community grew to 100 households, they were then to build a school building. The Puritans understood the need for literacy, particularly to enable all citizens to be able to read the scriptures for themselves in order to withstand the devil, or that old deluder Satan. The Old Deluder Act of 1647 predated the founding of America as a nation by more than 100 years, so it was not obviously an example of national government involvement in education. It was a local community effort that arose from the needs of local families, and it was focused only on teaching children to read, the most basic educational skill. Few of America's founding fathers received much of their education in an organized school setting. While some attended private schools, most were schooled at home by their parents or private tutors, or they were self-taught. Ben Franklin, for example, started school at the age of 8, then came home when he was 10 to assist in his father's business, and he learned mostly from his father, who, by the way, had very little or no formal schooling. Washington attended school for only 2 years, then taught himself. Jefferson studied with a private tutor. This was the early American pattern. Yet, as John Adams remarked in 1765, a native of America who cannot read or write is as rare an appearance as a comet or an earthquake. Schooling continued to be available for all who wanted it and pursued it. An 1830 article in the Philadelphia National Gazette said, "Education in general must be the work of the intelligence, need, and enterprise of individuals and associations. At present, in nearly all of the most populous parts of the United States, it is attainable for nearly all the inhabitants." Some New England schools were tax-supported under state law, but they had to compete with academically superior private academies. Education across most of the country, however, was completely laissez-faire. School attendance was voluntary, and schools were funded either privately or by charity. And what were the results of America's early education efforts prior to the rise of an organized school system? Well, according to the census of 1840, fully 90% of white adults were listed as literate. In 1860, that number had risen to 94%. By way of comparison, a 1993 U.S. Department of Education study showed that only 50% of American adults were moderately literate. In the early 1800s, changes in Europe led to state control of education there. Educational elites and intellectual leaders in America, particularly the Harvard Unitarians and followers of Robert Owen, were attracted to the idea, believing that placing all children in a centrally controlled institutional environment under the direction of the state would lead to a perfect society. It was the beginnings of socialism, even before the term was invented. These early American socialists were attracted to what was happening to education in Germany. The Prussian public school system had everything that they wanted: full state funding by involuntary taxation, teachers trained by the state, a standard state-prescribed curriculum, age-segregated classrooms with military-like discipline, compulsory attendance laws enforced by truant officers, and effective ways to keep independent-minded parents in check. Promoted first in liberal churches in New England, universal public education following the Prussian model soon became viewed as the best way to preserve America's Protestant majority from a flood of Catholic immigrants. Protestant denominations joined together on the basis of what they shared in common, hence the term common schools. But many did not realize that much of what they agreed to had a very different purpose, one that they would only begin to understand over a century later. And interestingly, after the American Civil War, Northern bankers and industrialists brought the Prussian model of schooling to the defeated South. Horace Mann, known as the father of American public education, oddly enough did not start out with any particular interest in education. His teaching experience was limited to 2 years as a tutor at Brown University just after his graduation from there. He went on to become a lawyer, then to serve in the Massachusetts state legislature. After his election in 1836, Massachusetts Governor Edward Everett set out to remake his state's education system after the Prussian model. As president of the Senate, Horace Mann led the passage of a new law that Everett wanted to allow him to appoint a state school board, effectively taking control of local schools out of the hands of local officials and placing it in the hands of the state. Everett then appointed Mann as the secretary of the new Massachusetts State School Board. Mann took on his new job with the zeal of a missionary, and he regarded the transformation of education into a state-controlled, tax-supported bureaucracy as a mission. Supported by wealthy, influential friends, Mann focused with the zeal of a martyr on the task of perfecting the human race and creating heaven on earth through universal state-run education. Abraham Lincoln had said, "The philosophy of the classroom in this generation will be the philosophy of politics, government, and life in the next." To determine the philosophy that would reign in the classroom, social planners and other supporters of state-run education had to determine who would be the teachers in the classroom and what the teachers would believe. To accomplish that, Mann concentrated on establishing teacher colleges known as normal schools. James G. Carter, in an 1825 pamphlet, called the first normal school at Lexington, Massachusetts, quote, "an engine to sway the public sentiment, the public morals, and the public religion more powerful than any other in the possession of the government," unquote. And it became a model that was visited, studied, and duplicated nationwide, though it contributed immediately to a reduced literacy by promoting the whole word method of teaching reading. Mann also set out to convince the middle and professional class to withdraw their children from private schools and to place them in the new common schools for the good of the entire society. He appealed to their religious sentiment first by pointing out that the common schools had first been set up for religious purposes, but he misrepresented what that purpose was, which was to teach children to read the scriptures, not that they might perfect other children by forced association. Nevertheless, many parents bought the statist argument that their duty to their community was more important than their duty to their children, and the purpose of public schools as instruments of social change first and academics second was quickly established. Though parents may not have known it, they were fulfilling the wildest dreams of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, who wrote in the Communist Manifesto in 1848 that they wanted to stop the exploitation of children by their parents by destroying the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. They wrote that the hallowed correlation of parents and child between the family and education was disgusting bourgeois claptrap. The next big player who was instrumental in applying this socialist statist education system to America was John Dewey, who furthered the demise of the neighborhood school and promoted the takeover of education by big industry and government via psychologically experimental methods. Dewey, like Mann, clearly understood the religious element that is inherent within education. Our schools, he said, are performing an infinitely religious work. They are promoting social unity. Religion associated with dogmatic beliefs we see disappearing. It is the part of man to work for the transformation of all practical instrumentalities of education till they are in harmony with these ideas. Underscoring the importance of Mann's earlier initiative to have the state teach the teachers, Dewey described teachers in almost Messiah-like terms. Every teacher should realize he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of the proper social order and the securing of the right social growth. In this way, the teacher is always the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of heaven. After taking over the teacher colleges, the next thing that these education statists had to do was to take charge of the textbooks that our children learned from. Gary North points out that what the textbook contains is not so important as what it leaves out. It leaves out evidence of rival views. The war for the minds of the next generation has been more carefully laid out by textbook committees than by any consortium or conspiratorial meeting behind closed doors. The textbook committees control by elimination. George Orwell wrote in his eerily accurate book, 1984, "Whoever controls the image and information of the past determines what and how future generations will think. Whoever controls the information and images of the present determines how these same people will view the past." Lester Frank Ward, the father of American central planning, who called education a systematic process for the manufacture of correct opinions, laid down the design template for school textbooks using this exclusion method. Our minds, he said, resist coercion to change our deep-seated opinions. But if educators, particularly those who wrote the textbooks that all schools would use, would eliminate any mention of competing ideas, nothing would be left in our minds but those opinions that the educators want us to have. And what ideas did those educators want us to have? Why, that there's nothing more important for us to learn while we are young than that which is necessary for us to go out, get a good job, and become productive members of society. Elsewhere in this course, you learn about a group of politicians, bankers, and businessmen who met in secret in 1913 on Jekyll Island, and how that meeting quite radically changed life in America. At around the same time as that fateful visit to Jekyll Island, many of these same players who gave us the Federal Reserve System were involved in other business ventures besides banking. They realized that they needed a cooperative, submissive, and well-trained workforce in order to accomplish their goals. Schools, then, were to play a vital role in producing these workers. In 1917, another meeting took place involving many of the same players, names like Rockefeller and Carnegie, that just as radically changed life and lifelong opinions in America by altering the direction of government-controlled schooling. This group, the Education Trust, included not only big players from the world of finance and big business, but also from the world of education. Names like Harvard and Stanford and the National Education Association. And their purpose, according to British evolutionist Benjamin Kidd, was to impose on the young the ideal of subordination. As former New York State Teacher of the Year John Taylor Gatto described it, students were to learn to think of themselves as employees competing for the favor of management, not as Franklin or Edison had once regarded themselves as self-determined free agents. No longer were rugged individualism and Yankee entrepreneurialism to be regarded as the strength and pride of America. Instead, young people were taught that their strength was to be found in submission to the greater good of the group, or as a backwards look at history shows, to the manpower needs of industrialists who had invested huge amounts of capital in new machinery that required factory workers to operate. And a new term was born, human resources. Yes, there has been, for almost the past 100 years, a deliberate effort made to actually use education to captivate the majority of American citizens to a working-class existence. Charlotte Iserby writes in The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, "The mind of the average American became trained or conditioned to accept the idea that education exists solely for the purpose of getting a good job in the global workforce economy. School, according to John Taylor Gatto, was looked upon from the first decade of the 20th century as a branch of industry and a tool of governance. But did it stop then, after the era of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies? Hardly. The U.S. Department of Labor under the first Bush presidency released a statement that said, "All schools must bend single-mindedly to the task of socializing a skilled workforce." So the history of education in America tells a story of the takeover of our schools, first by socialists who saw government as the way to assure universal compliance with their plan to perfect mankind and to produce a heaven on earth, and then by big business and banking interests who saw the government-controlled schools as a means to always have a willing and compliant workforce. Most citizens today have been brought up in a government-controlled school, and now they have almost inbred in them the idea that education is properly a natural role of the government. The government certainly wants us to continue to think that way, for it believes that it also has a vital role to play in educating our children. According to Stanford University political science professor Rob Reich, the state has an independent interest in education for citizenship that may not be shared by parents. What is that independent interest? Well, the U.S. Department of Education says that education is a means to achieve important economic and social goals of a national character. The economic goals are to satisfy the demands of industry by keeping a steady stream of workers graduating and flowing into the world's widget factories. The social goals, which remember were the first reason given to bring the schools under the control of the state, are to satisfy the social liberals among us who believe in the perfectibility of man and the attainment of a heaven on earth. Remember, according to Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, it takes a village to raise a child. And if some other member of the village has a different opinion about what we should do with our children and their education and upbringing, we could well be outvoted. But we already are being outvoted. According to William Sewell, professor of education at the University of Virginia, each child belongs to the state. What is the state's goal for the education of our children? Professor Sewell identified it when he described the purpose of education as, quote, "the training of citizens for the state so the state may be perpetuated," unquote. Just as it takes trained human resources to keep an industry alive, so it takes trained cooperative subjects to keep the state alive. State control of education is not some new plan that was just formulated yesterday. It's been around quite a while, and it is certainly not unique to America. And it was not found only in Germany before it was brought here. Fascist dictator Benito Mussolini of Italy also had a pretty good handle on state-run education when he said, "At every hour of every day, I can tell you on what page of which book each schoolchild in Italy is studying." And whether or not we as parents like the idea of the state dictating what our children should learn and controlling how our tax dollars are spent that pay for this education, that is exactly the program that is now being carried out in every tax-supported school in America. Professor Reich sees three parties with an interest in education: the parents, the state, and the child himself. But he says that parental authority must end when its exercise compromises the development of minimal autonomy in children. If parental authority over education does not conduce to the self-sufficiency and independence of their children, the state must step in and ensure such outcomes. This is the statist view, that in the education equation, only the state is sovereign.
Now that you've been introduced to the basics of Common Core, it's time to expose where and who it came from. Back in 2007, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Eli Broad Foundation pledged $60 million to the development of uniform American standards. They targeted a pair of Washington, D.C.-based organizations, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, to develop and implement a political strategy creating these national standards. The NGA and the CCSSO have no official relationship with states or schools, so they partnered with Achieve Inc., another DC-based organization that began seeking common state standards back in 1998. Together, they wrote Benchmarking for Success. Benchmarking for Success is a common standards visioning document in which students are labeled human capital, and the ideal education system would mimic successful global competitors, such as China. This document repeatedly emphasizes human capital, collective influence, international benchmarks, aligned materials, monitoring, intervention, and global measurement of performance. Achieve then took the document and their political strategy to Secretary of Education Arne Duncan in 2009. Congress, meanwhile, earmarked $4.35 billion, that's billion with a B, to improve state standards and ensure academic success through the 2009 stimulus package, otherwise known as the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The same week that ARA was announced, Common Core was introduced to the states via Race to the Top grants, a competitive system of federal funding awarded to states who meet specific requirements. The connection to special interest groups continued to strengthen as top executives from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in another backdoor deal, were selected to take positions in the Department of Education, one as Secretary Arne Duncan's Chief of Staff, and the other as the Chief Officer of the Office of Innovation and Improvement. On June 1, 2009, the standards were officially introduced, mimicking the Benchmarking for Success document with a few notable changes. Objectives were added addressing comprehensive data systems aimed at measuring students, internationally benchmarked assessments, and other invasive programs. In March of 2010, the federal government increased the pressure on cash-strapped states to implement Common Core standards and the surrounding requirements by stating that states may not receive other federal formula funds if they have not fully implemented Common Core by 2015. At this time, the actual standards were not fully written, developed, or approved, yet states were handcuffed to implementing the program, and unsuspecting school districts, parents, teachers, and students were in the dark about what was ahead. Experts reviewing the proposed curriculum refused to sign off on the standards, yet they were still passed along to the states and our children. In 2011, Achieve began working on the National Next Generation Science Standards, and will soon begin developing social studies standards. Common Core's tentacles continue to expand even today. In May of 2013, President Obama introduced his Preschool for All initiative, providing Race to the Top grants to states who are then required to accept expanded data collection, common standards, and a partnership with Health and Human Services for children as young as 3 years old.
Hi, everybody. This is Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain Radio. I hope you're doing well. We're very pleased to have the highly energetic and charismatic public speaker and educator, Dr. Duke Pester. He is a tenured university professor, author, and the academic director of Freedom Project Academy, which is a live online school which offers individual classes, complete curricula for students in kindergarten through high school. You can check out the website at fpeusa.org. Now, with no, and I guess always with no, Common Core. Dr. Duke, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much, Duke. Great to be with you today.
6 years. Boy, you can get a lot done in 6 years. And in the 6 years that Common Core has first begun to creep its inky way into the lifeblood of the American educational system, I think people are beginning to wake up to some of the dangers and the damage that it can do. So I wonder if you can help people to understand what Common Core is and how this beast came to be.
Well, you know, it's a huge 6 years, and probably 50 years before that, the federal government was working towards this. The short answer is that Common Core represents the federalization of education in America, more than at any time in our historical past, and certainly in very unconstitutional ways now. The federal government is in charge of curriculum, in charge of standards, and in charge of testing our kids. None of this is technically legal. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution, of course, prevents the federal government from meddling in state educational policy. But this has been a slow creep. For decades and decades, the feds have been accruing more and more power to themselves. As you know, in the late 1970s, with the creation of the Federal Department of Education, once you did that, once we had a big bureaucracy in Washington who dedicated itself to education, there's no doubt that over time they were going to take more and more responsibility to themselves. Common Core represents the biggest step forward in the federalization of education. And there are two main problems, number one. Number one is this centralization, this control. The more the federal government controls our kids' schools, the less access and opportunity parents have to impact their kids' education, the less local school districts matter. Indeed, entire state education departments will quickly become moot. All they're going to do is implement federal directives. They have no originary ability to change things now in a meaningful way. So that's number one. And number two, as always happens with the federal government, what they do is when they have this kind of control over anything, now healthcare and now education, they use it to import ideology. They use it to support their statist observations, their statist requirements. They use healthcare as a tool to control people, and now they are doing the same thing with education. So besides being a illegal, really contra-legal federal takeover of education, it is also a Trojan horse, Common Core, to transform American education from primarily skills and knowledge-based to primarily ideological now.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards.
That was Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft and also the bankroller of Common Core. As you sit here today listening to me, Bill Gates has spent $6 billion on Common Core. That's where we should start in this little overview of why America should be worried about Common Core. Paid for to the tune of $6 billion by non-educators, crafted behind closed doors by political partisans and ideologues, Common Core are a set of national standards for English and math with all other subject areas coming, and they're going to completely transform the way we educate your kids. There are two main problems with Common Core. One is the loss of state and local control. And two, the fact that once the federal government has begun to accrue educational power to itself, it uses that power to indoctrinate children. Take point number one, state and local control. Do we honestly believe that the federal government knows better how to educate 60 million American school kids than our local communities and our local teachers do? In our long history as a country, once the federal government assumes responsibility for something, even if they cannot make it work, they never cede that responsibility back to the states. Right now in your kids' classrooms, if there's a book or a movie that you don't want your kid to see, if there's some lesson, a sexuality lesson that's being taught that you want to exempt your kids from, you can do that by going to the school and opting out. But once every aspect of your child's curriculum becomes linked to the national standards and are tested at the national level, you will not be able to opt your children out. The federal government, the state, will have to determine when and if they'll grant waivers. And do we have faith that they're going to do that for you? Right now, we want local control. We want to maximize the ability of our teachers to deal with our children who in communities where they know best what should be done. Bill Gates, you heard the clip. The Common Core standards are going to align with the curriculum. One of the great lies of Common Core is it's just a set of standards, not a curriculum. You heard Bill Gates say directly into the camera that the purpose of Common Core is to align these broad national tests to the curriculum. That's a problem. The second problem is that, and we've already begun to see it with Common Core, as more and more of this power and control is ceded to the federal government, they're using it to rewrite academic standards, academic achievement. They're using that power to import all sorts of sociological experimentation into your kids. You've heard about the horrors of data mining, how through these big national tests, these computer-based tests, dramatic information is being gathered on your children and disseminated to all sorts of governmental group and even private organizations. Besides the lack of privacy through data mining, you're getting a remarkably radical agenda fed through English and even math class, as traditional ways of math are not just being supplemented by new Common Core ways of doing math, they're being eliminated in favor of the new Common Core paradigm only. We're creating a situation where moms and dads are unable to help their kids with their homework, where they don't even get to see the assignments that their kids are doing in the classroom. This is a serious issue, to say nothing of all the related things that are coming with Common Core. Whatever else Common Core is, it's also a Trojan horse through which the federal government can feed all sorts of different agendas. I would urge you to take a look at the National sexuality standards. Type that into Google and take a look at that document. Common Core will be one thing that facilitates the imposition of this really shocking and age-inappropriate sexuality education through Common Core classrooms, starting with kids as young as kindergarten. And then, besides the ideological problems with Common Core, besides the control issues that come with Common Core at the national level, you've also got a host of other related issues as well. And these are really critical moving forward for American education. The testing, for instance. These tests are monolithic. They're huge. They're one size fits all. The idea that one broad national test, which is going to be the only meaningful way that your kids and their teachers are going to be evaluated, controlled, ultimately in Washington, D.C. The idea that this is going to be a fair representation of what goes on in your classrooms, it just won't work that way. As a matter of fact, let me leave you with a short clip from David Coleman, who is the architect of Common Core, talking about how your teachers will no longer have the freedom to teach what they want to teach, how they want to teach it. For more information after you watch this short clip from David Coleman, visit Freedom Project Education, FPEUSA.org, for all sorts of free information, videos, articles, links that will give you a much broader explanation for the things that I've just explained to you in this short overview. I'm going to leave you with the horrifying David Coleman right now.
Teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying, they teach the standards, not the test. We don't do that here. Whatever.
Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser. Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. The Common Core State Standards Initiative is an education initiative that seeks to align diverse state curricula with the principles of standards-based education. The initiative was sponsored by the National Governors Association. This education reform movement was designed to raise academic standards, graduation requirements, improve assessments, and strengthen accountability in all 50 states. But the Common Core Initiative has drawn criticism from across the political spectrum as a federal top-down takeover of state and local education systems. The Heritage Foundation argues that Common Core focuses on national standards and will do little to fix deeply ingrained problems and incentivize structures within the education system. Some education experts argue that Common Core standards lack sufficient public input and were driven by corporate interests and policymakers rather than experienced educators. Our guest today, Gretchen Logue, has been interested in educational issues for over 2 decades. She is the founder of the Missouri Education Watchdog, an educational blog, and co-founder of Missouri Coalition Against Common Core, a site to inform Missourians on the Common Core issues. Gretchen Logue, welcome to Conversation.
Thank you, Lee.
Boy, that was a mouthful. Did I get it right?
Pretty much.
Okay,
Yeah.
So we've encapsulated what it is we're going to talk about today, but I know you have a whole lot more to say. First of all, what was it, from your perspective, that the people who were trying to found the idea of standards for students got wrong?
Standards in and of themselves are not bad. We need standards in education, and in fact, our state constitution in Missouri gives the state the ability and the authority to set the direction and development of the standards. So it's always been a state issue. Mm-hmm. What's different about Common Core is that the standards now are driven by 2 private trade organizations. You said the National Governors Association and the Chief Council of State School Officers.
What's that? What, I know with the national governors.
Yes. CCSSO, mainly school chiefs, superintendents, they have all banded together. They are funded by the federal government. Mm-hmm. So what they did is they got together and they decided that the states, with the NGA, needed a set of standards that were common. And so funded by the federal government, they were the ones that created these standards that now 45 states have signed on to.
What's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with that is that it's illegal.
Well, but if the governors are doing, how could it be illegal? I mean, they're the governors.
Well, basically what you have...
And they're the superintendents.
Well, yes, but the governors signed the authority to go with these consortia, but the governors really, there's been a question on whether they have the authority to actually do that. Because what they've done is that they've signed over the control of the standards for a state and put it in a consortium.
Now, didn't didn't Missouri legislature sign off on this?
No.
Okay.
This bypassed state legislators and it bypassed the voters. In fact, it bypassed the national legislators as well, Congress. Unlike No Child Left Behind, that was signed, was a law. Congress voted on the specifics of the law. What we would like people to start understanding about Common Core, it's a massive stimulus program. It's a $4.35 billion check that Congress gave Arne Duncan and said, here's a check.
Who's Arne Duncan?
Secretary of Education, United States. You fix education. And it was kind of a hands-off sort of a thing. So what they did is, if you think about it, the Department of Education is using these two organizations, the NGA and the CCSSO, as their surrogates. Federal government cannot set standards for states, they can't set curriculum, and they can't set personnel decisions. They can't set teacher evaluations.
Why can't they?
That is in the law.
Okay.
All right. They can't do it. So what they've done, in a sense, is that they have these surrogates that they're funding. They're doing it with federal money. And they're passing it off as being state-led.
World government plan known as Agenda 21.
Start our second session this afternoon. You heard this morning about all the plans to transform your communities and rob your property and rip your whole communities apart in the name of sustainable development and smart growth. The question has been asked many times how the people who are perpetrating these things expect to do this and make it last when you have a nation of people who were raised and educated on individual rights and the Constitution and so forth. And the answer to that is that you steal a generation of children and you indoctrinate them so that they accept these ideas and they become global citizens in the coming global village. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about here this afternoon. Michael Chapman is an educational researcher and an author. He is also a member of the board of the Maple River Education Coalition and founder of the American Heritage Research. Through research and study, the Maple River Coalition is finding a direct link between the restructuring of our schools through federal programs like Goals 2000 and School to Work, and the restructuring of our communities through sustainable development. Michael Chapman and his group have discovered that today, as revealed in the national curriculum standards, education is no longer about preparing our children to maintain true liberty in a sovereign America. Instead, it is about indoctrinating our children to accept citizenship in a future global village. Today, Michael Chapman comes to us from Minnesota to reveal how the so-called standards movement masks the true agenda to a radically transformed America. Please welcome Michael Chapman.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you all for sitting in this long. It's been a long day, and you've heard some great speakers. I couldn't help but sitting back in the back of the room listening to Michael Shaw and Michael Kaufman and Minnesota. And for Michael Shaw's benefit, of course, that's the Midwest version of the left coast. But realistically, Minnesota was the very first state in the nation, in fact, the only state in the nation to sign the Declaration of World Citizenship back in 1971. Now, this was the same year that the EPA was instituted. Propaganda meant to transform this nation. Lincoln once said the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will become the philosophy of government in the next. We are reaping the consequences of having turned a generation of children over to this new system. It's not too surprising then that UNESCO, in their September 2003 conference on education for a sustainable future, came out and declared 2005 to 2015 the decade of education for sustainable development. You will be hearing this term everywhere you go from now on for the next 10 years. Education for sustainable development. And surprise, surprise, they named UNESCO the lead agency for that effort, who said their goal is to integrate sustainable development into all levels of education in order to promote education as a key agent for change. Now, what does that mean? If you go to the UNESCO's website on education for sustainable development, you will find out the new role of education. They state, Chapter 36 of Agenda 21 embraces all ways in which people learn about the world around them, develop the values and lifestyles, and assume their responsibilities as global citizens to prepare for the future. Now that's why I title my talk Development, i.e. Global Citizenship, is to be realized. Now this is a bureaucratic revolution in education. The prime bureaucracy is the U.S. Department of Education, which was instituted in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter as a promise to put the principles of sustainable development in place before the term was coined. But this was the entire purpose of the U.S. Department of Education, now I believe the world's largest employer. Under its direction is the Office of Education Research and Improvement. They oversee the 10 regional education laboratories. You can go to their website and see these are the 10 regions of the U.S., and each region has a director and a directorate to be responsible for each piece. Now, it was the Mid-Continental Regional Education Laboratory, which recently changed their name, that was in charge of putting together the national curriculum. They called it the standards-based movement by looking at the curriculum. But first I want to play a little video clip of the senior director of the Mid-Continental Regional Education Laboratory in 1989 as she revealed to the National Governors Association the agenda for education. She's going to list 3 important aspects of what education is about. Listen to for the 3.
It seems to me that far too much of our efforts have been focused on the issue of let's find a short-term fix and fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation in the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society. And the issue for most children and the issues for the society is that what has changed in education today is that we no longer see the teaching of facts and information as the primary outcome of education. During the past 10 years, we've been going through a reform movement. And that reform movement began with the governors of the nation, and basically what their concern was that they began to understand the very close relationship between economic development and human capital.
Did you catch the 3 parts? Number 1, the total transformation of society. Number 2, facts and information, knowledge, is no longer the primary purpose of education. And number 3, the close connection between economic, let's call it sustainable development, and human capital, that is labor, human resource labor for a planned economy. Now,
This month, Oklahoma became the latest state to take a big step toward repealing national so-called Common Core education standards. The Oklahoma State Senate passed a bill just last week to do so. This, as more than a dozen other states are also considering repeal, and still others are reviewing how they use the standards when it comes to teaching and testing. It is a big shift from the broad and often bipartisan support that Common Core enjoyed just a few years ago. Jeffrey Brown has the story.
Common Core was initiated in 2009 by the nation's governors, seeking national standards for math and English literacy. U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan supported the move, spending $350 million to develop Common Core tests.
I believe this new generation of assessments is an absolute game changer for American education.
In relatively short order, nearly every state agreed to create curricula based on the Common Core guidelines. But more recently, a backlash has begun. Last month, Indiana became the first state to drop the Common Core standards it had already adopted. Governor Mike Pence explained the move in an Indianapolis radio interview.
Hoosiers should be very proud and take every opportunity to be engaged in the fact that we're the first state in the country that's really going back to the principle that education is a state and local function.
Now, Oklahoma and other states are moving to follow Indiana's lead. The criticism initially stemmed from conservatives leery of federal involvement, with some labeling the program Obamacare. Pennsylvania Congressman John Klein chairs the House Education Committee.
That's the ultimate fear, that the federal government does get in the curriculum business and tells the states what they're supposed to teach.
There's been criticism on the left as well, particularly over testing requirements. New York's Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo has said execution of the standards was, quote, flawed. The program still has its champions, though. One is the Republican former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Last Sunday on Fox News, he made a push for Common Core.
If you don't have high expectations, high standards, you're not going to go anywhere. The idea that it's a federal program it's just not true. It's just not. It was voluntarily created by governors.
Meanwhile, the repeal move is gathering momentum. It's expected to clear the Oklahoma legislature in the next few weeks.
My name is Charlotte Thompson-Iserbay, and I served as Senior Policy Advisor in the United States Department of Education under the Reagan administration, during which I had access to all of the most important documents for the restructuring of not only American education but global education. And I'm also the author of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, which gets into all of this, gives the background of what I saw not only in the Department of Education but as a local school board member. I was trained to identify the resistors to the sex ed, drug ed, alcohol ed, suicide ed, death ed, those good, smart Americans who realize that anything that has education hanging off the end of it is probably not what they're looking for. I was trained to identify those good people and to go up against them, and actually to go and try to get them to join us through the group process system, make them feel important, get them on a committee. And I went and I saw that Americans were being trained to identify resistors. Then I got pretty upset. And luckily, there was a big book that came with the in-service training called Innovations in Education, A Change Agent's Guide. And I was able to take that back home with me. Unbelievable examples of how to con the Christians and different people who are upset with what you're trying to do, how to bring them over to your side. Case studies, true case studies of educators who had put programs in that normally, in a normal American town, nobody would want them. How did they manage to get them in? How did they con the people? And the other thing was, not only was I trained to identify the resistors, I was trained to go to the important people, high profile, highly thought of people in the community, with the Rotary and Chamber of Commerce, Garden Club, you name it, the different groups in our towns. Go to them and convince them of the importance of these new programs like sex ed, drug ed, I just mentioned all of them, and to get them on your side, because when you can get the leadership in a community to go along with it, then the newspaper comes in and says, you know, a committee's been set up with the head of the Rotary and this and that, and they're all getting behind this task force to discuss whether we're going to have a new sex education program. And then when Mary Jones, you know, who ordinarily would think, why would we want to have a sex education program when we don't have any problems with kids having sex or anything? So she might be, you know, concerned. She might be one of the resistors. She reads that her best friend, who's the head of the garden club, is on this committee, and she thinks, oh, well, hey, Mary Appleton is on that committee. She's heading it up. Must be okay. So I was taught really how to con the community. They always call everybody really bright people in the community who have these concerns. And would you like to join our group? The original program was funded by what would subsequently become my office. It was funded by the Office of Research in the U.S. Office of Education, because it was funded early on, about the late 60s. Still funded, by the way. And the money went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to a professor by the name of Ronald Havelock. And he was the one that put together the whole training, the whole seminar, the book. And in the back of the book you had, they admitted it, right in the back of the book, they had about 100 major change agents listed from all over the country. Some of them I recognize, some I still don't, but some I do. And so this was a very important project. And it was being, you know, it was being carried out in I'm sure, all over the country, not just where I was. The disorder, excuse me. Professor Benjamin Bloom is probably the most important behavioral psychologist ever to live. I mean, maybe not quite as much as Pavlov and Skinner, but he really implemented the system in education in the United States. And he was the author of the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. And I know that doesn't mean much to us. It means a lot to teachers. They know. All teachers have to go through that, Bloom's Taxonomy. And just to give you an idea of how blatant they are, Benjamin Bloom said the purpose of education, and I often say this to parents, really, listen to this. You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students. And then he goes on and he says, he defines good teaching, and this is even worse from the parental standpoint, as challenging the student's fixed beliefs. And then, in some of his works that I have, that are in my book, a lot of this stuff is in it.
When he says challenge, does he mean challenge or does he mean change? Change their fixed?
Yeah, through challenging. It's through challenging. You go up against them. And you change them. And you asked a good question, because then he goes on in one part of the taxonomy that is in my book. He says that he can take a student from here to there, from a belief in God or his country or whatever, to being an atheist and not believing in his country in 1 hour.
Did he do that?
Oh yeah, he does it. And I've seen it with students. I've seen it with young people. And they don't even know, and teachers don't even know. That's why if you talk to teachers about it often, they really have an awfully hard time dealing with it. And if you go up to a superintendent, an educational administrator, superintendent or whatever, and you ask him or her, have you ever been through sensitivity training? They'll usually crack up because they went through it. But it was really the oil pipelines, I think, of Rockefeller that we were protecting. We're in Grenada, we go back to the United States. I put the children in public school. So, here we go. I had no idea that education would be any different from sort of what I'd had. I had had a good education, a private school education. But I didn't know. And so they go into the public school system in Camden, Maine. And in retrospect, I believe that that was a pilot school, one of them for the whole country, for changing our education system from an academic, classical educational system to brainwashing for the international socialist government. Everybody has all the research on this. I have so much. It's all in my book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. I hit Camden, and I start asking, I get on a little committee, philosophy committee, and we're all asked by the superintendent, highly skilled change agent out of Harvard, well, I want to know what all of you feel the purpose of education should be. And so I said, well, I think it should be to give the students a sound academic education in basics and also a strong sense of sound morals and values. And boom, they all looked at me and they said, whose values? And I thought, hey, what's going on here? I said, well, what's happened in my country? I mean, don't we still have the same values? I mean, don't we all sort of agree? You don't steal, you don't rob, you don't kill babies, you don't kill people in war, a lot of things that I thought we believed in. You don't lie. Everything was changing, and I saw it, and I saw the curriculum coming in, and I went for the values clarification training myself to find out. I had a call from a master teacher who taught all over the world, and she said, you are absolutely correct. I was on the school board by that time. After 3 tries, I got on. And she said, you're absolutely correct. I want to pay for you to go for some in-service training. And I said, in what? And she said, well, it's called Innovations in Education, and it's how to become a change agent. She paid $100 for me to go. I went. And all these normal-looking people, nice, some from my own school district and all, and the guy is a facilitator, but he's using this big book called Innovations in Education, A Change Agent's Guide, and it has all these case studies of teachers and administrators and how to sneak in controversial curriculum such as death ed, sex ed, bullying ed, alcohol ed, drug ed, all these programs that have education hanging off the end of them that have nothing to do with education. It's interesting. You don't have math ed and science ed and all. They call it math and science and history, right? But when you see anything with education hanging off the end of it, red flag, huh? In that training, he taught us how to identify resistors in our community. And they were the people who were smart, who knew that these programs were designed for nothing other than to make children engage in sex, to drink, to take drugs, to do all of the things that the parents were being told the programs were to help the children. I was considered a resistor too. Here they were training me to identify myself, huh? And so I never ever got over that. Also, we were being trained to go to the important people in the community, and they're really very good people. We all know who they are. They're friends of ours and all, but they're head of Rotary, head of Garden Club, head of Historical Society. You go to them, and you explain to them in very, very good, highly skilled change agent manner, which is just lies, how important these programs are for your children. We've got to put these programs in. This was 1973, all the way through right now. Huh? That period in education, we call it the unfreezing of our children's values, the ones taught by the parents at home and the church, basically. Change agents were highly trained by the National Training Laboratories. We had the headquarters for that in Bethel, Maine. That goes all the way back to World War II. I have the original paper from that, and it said that what they're putting in is they want to change the values to unfreeze the system, and then they're going to implement the new values, the new communist values for world government. So that was the goal, and they did a good job on it between 1970 and the year 2000. And now the values, as we can all see, people are saying, oh, well, we've got to be tolerant, there are no absolutes anymore. That's not fair to judge people. Don't be judgmental. If your grandmother is dying of cancer and you can't afford the medicine, it's okay to steal it. That's what you call values clarification with the education for a planned economy, using workforce training, identifying children at a very early age, what they're going to do the rest of their lives. It's the Soviet planned economic system, starting as early as first grade. the education for Maine. And we were in business for about 15 years. We did a lot of very good work. In 1980, I went to work for Ronald Reagan, and I worked there for 2 years until I was fired. Right. But I had worked hard for him from 1978 to get him elected. Right. And then in 1980, because of the work I'd done and the work in education, they put me, I got an appointment in the U.S. Department of Education. Because the people in Washington, with the conservatives, they were good back then. They're not anymore. They were very impressed by the work I'd done in Maine on education. So they pulled me down and put me in the U.S. Department of Ed in what was the most important slot probably in the world in education. I know people out there are shaking their heads and say, why would they put her there? She doesn't have a college education, right? Why are they putting her in there? Well, they knew, first of all, Reagan had promised to get rid of the Department of Education, something he didn't do, and I will hold that against him forever, because he could have. Since that was the plan, when they were staffing the department, they didn't have to put important people in those old slots. Like my slot that I got put into would have been filled by the former president of Harvard, or Stanford, or something, right? Or University of Chicago. That job had been held in the past by very important people in education. But since they were getting rid of the department, it didn't make any difference. So they just plopped me in. Now talk about the hand of God, huh? And all my files were full of everything they planned on doing. And so I don't even think my boss knew this. You know, he was the so-called conservative. But he became very suspicious about me because I was always busy. Even though I didn't have a lot of work to do from him, I was always busy because I had lots of things to read. And I would stay after work. I'd stay until 2 a.m. in the morning. When everybody was gone, I'd get into everything. Sure, if it had just been the job and all the files and everything had been whisked away by these former very important educational change agent communists, Marxists, I would not have found stuff, but all the stuff was left in the office. What I saw was so depressing. That's hardly the word. I mean, this was the education of Charlotte. It was the greatest horror story I had ever encountered. And at one point, he sent me, he wanted to get rid of me out of that office. He sent me up to the National Institute of Education, which is where all the research is performed. They send out all the grants and contracts to the universities or schools or whatever from there. I found out I was really in the belly of the beast right there, because I had access to all the computer printouts of all the grants and contracts of your money, folks, going out not just across our country, but all around the world, about how to change the education system from academics to a brainwashing using Pavlovian, Skinnerian, operant conditioning computers and workforce training for the globalist economy, the corporate fascist, socialist, communist government that's coming right in this minute. I had a friend from Maryland who used to come and she had a huge Cadillac, and I'd get all my stuff and put it in, interesting for Maine people, LL bean bags. You know those big LL bean bags? Those huge ones? And I'd put all the papers in there, and at lunchtime we'd meet uptown for lunch. She'd come in, marvelous gal, Australian, who I absolutely love, probably one of the finest Americans who ever, she was Australian, but she did more for our country than anybody I've ever known. Brilliant. We'd meet, dump the stuff in her car, go have lunch, she'd take it home. She'd get some of it out to the people across the country. It was not a really exciting job. It was mainly to see if the universities, the schools, the different entities across the country that were getting money, or around the world, from the taxpayers, that they were getting their quarterly reports in on time. That's all. It had nothing to do with philosophy. Huh? And so one day I ran across a grant to Lansing School District. Lansing, Michigan. This was University of Michigan connection with my office. And it was a values clarification program for first graders, elementary school. And it pre- and post-tested those little children about what goes on at home, what religion do you... And I looked at this thing and I thought, what on earth are they doing? And so I turned to this bureaucrat who was working with the GAO about financial things. And I said, look, we're doing waste, fraud, and abuse. I know that. But I said, take a look at this. Don't you think that this is pretty wasteful, fraudulent, and abusive in another way? And so he took a look at it and he said, oh my Lord. He said, this is horrible. And really nice guy, bureaucrat, Washington. People sometimes get after all the bureaucrats. They're not all that bad. Some of them are just like us, and they care. And I said, well, look, I'm only meant to be here 2 weeks, but could you give me extra time? Because I want to go through all these grants and contracts. And he said, you can have as much time as you want. So I spent 6 weeks up there going through all the stuff. And I can't tell you how horrible. First of all, even if you don't care about children, you don't care about education, you don't care about your country, you don't care about anything, people? Are there people out there who don't care about anything? They do care about their wallet, huh? You should care about this money that has been spent in the name of education. It's total brainwashing. Anything coming out of Washington is a total Marxist brainwash. And Marxism is the world of the future unless we stop it right now. I'm fired for leaking one of these documents to Human Events. It was the one that put technology into, with the computer on, with the curriculum on it. It was a grant going out to every single state with the computer curriculum for the state. Can you imagine, designed by Washington and all the different government education associations? And within that big paper that I found, Better Education Skills Through Technology, it was called, Project BEST. I found this one paper, this was sort of a draft, and it said, what we at the federal level can control and manipulate. That's a direct quote, colon. And then it listed, this is for us at the local level because we don't know how to run our own laws, and the state. I get fired. Then I write the president, I write Reagan, and I tell him what's going on in the department. And I said, you would be shocked if you knew. This place has got to be shut down, etc. And it was a long letter. I explained everything, that the U.S. Department of Education is a Marxist factory designed to destroy any semblance of good values, academics, etc., and to make sure our children march blindly into a socialist communist world government. That's the goal of the U.S. Department of Education. They didn't want anyone to know that Ronald Reagan had that letter. So I never got a reply. I tried to. I called Ed Meese. I went home, called Ed Meese, who was the chief counselor or whatever in the White House, and I said, I want to talk to you all. I want an answer to that letter. Finally, I went down and talked with Ed Meese's aide, Ken Cribb, and I said, he patted me on the shoulder, that way they do that. Oh, Charlotte, aren't you pleased to know the president got your letter? That's an admission right there. I know he got it because John Lofton, a journalist at that time in Washington, called his office, the White House, back in 1983 or something, and asked. And they said, yes, it's on his desk, and he's marked it up. So let's get that straight. He had it. The purpose of that letter was to make sure that that department is abolished and the American public education is returned to its original status, run at the local level and with elected school board members and with no influence whatsoever from the federal or international level. That's how it should be. It was the best education system in the world. That's what I was asking for. Anyway, it didn't happen. That letter to Reagan, again, is on my website, Deliberate Dumbing Down, under a PDF. I wrote in 1985 a book called Back to Basics Reform or Skinnerian International Curriculum. And to make sure people read this little 39-pager, I decided to put an asterisk so that they didn't really have to read it. I put an asterisk which said, necessary for United States participation in a one-world socialist government plan for the early years of the 21st century. When the conservatives, the neocons, let's call them that, not Goldwater people, when the neoconservatives, Heritage Foundation, all of those groups, I'm sorry folks, when they saw that book, they boycotted it. They boycotted that book, which told Americans exactly what I just told all of you, what I'd seen, and that we had to get rid of the department. It all happened under Ronald Reagan. You call it what you want: corporate fascism, socialism, communism, planned economy. You call it what you want. What is it? It's really, it's horrible. Your children have no upward mobility whatsoever. I told you earlier. I said, yeah, they're put into a slot early on. The government and the schools, they decide what your child is capable of doing the rest of his life. He might be able to sneak out of that sometime if he's brilliant and do his own thing, but it's unlikely. So it's fixed. This is the end of upward mobility for our children, end of freedom for this country. Planned economy is the end of freedom. It's a failed system, but there are people at the top who live very well by it. And then I find out that Ronald Reagan has signed an agreement with Gorbachev to merge the two education systems. Well, you can't tell me that conservatives didn't know that was going on, because I know some who were at Geneva when this happened. And they didn't do anything about it, but we found out. And so we fought this United States-Soviet Education Exchange Agreement. The Carnegie Corporation also signed agreements. Basically, most of that was to do with computers and technology and critical thinking for little elementary school children. Those agreements were signed. We raised $5,000 to put an ad in the Washington Times to expose that. It was called Educate is Worse Than Watergate or something. And but again, we got no support because that information wasn't meant to get out. Then, about 4 years after the fact, my little article was called "Soviets in the Classroom: America's Latest Education Fad," that nobody would touch. The conservatives, all the different conservative groups, media and all, would not publish it. And all of a sudden, I got a phone call from a wonderful man by the name of Robert Morris, who was a judge from New Jersey. He calls and he said, I'm now the president of America's Future. And I had tried to get this article published by America's Future, Soviets in the Classroom. And I couldn't get it published. It was interesting because America's Future used to do a lot of articles on bad textbooks and everything in the United States. And I thought surely they would be interested in the United States-Soviet textbook agreement, too, and exchanges. And I was sure but no, they would not publish it. So this Bob Morris became president. He found my article in a drawer in the desk that was left there, the manuscript. And he read it, and he thought, oh, what is this? Can you imagine? He's a leading conservative himself, very important person. He had not heard about it. He had not heard what Reagan had done. It's happened ever since 1958, when the first agreement was signed by Eisenhower with the Soviet Union at the peak of the Cold War. And then the various agreements have been signed all the way through until recently, one with China. So we have merged, and let me point out, just today, I was informed that there are forces at work in the state of Maine that are surrounding our wonderful people that we elected last November. Traditional Mainers, good, hard-working Mainers who were very upset about what's going on. They worked hard to get our governor in, a wonderful man, Paul LePage. And I want to warn all of you that out in your states, if you elected some really good people, they've been surrounded. And you've got to be very careful. You've got to let them know not to go along with any of the agendas that call for regional government or consolidation. Because regionalism, the merging of services, the police forces in one town, police force merges with another one, the schools consolidate, all the little schools merge into a big one. They tell you that's to save money and all. They're lying to you because it doesn't. We know that. It doesn't save money. But what it really is, regionalism is communism. And I have an article, it's in Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. You can look up the name Zeitlin. You will see this communist writer for the Communist Daily World in the mid-70s talking about the need for the United States to implement regionalism and consolidation. It's communism. So any effort that you see out there where they use the word, they don't use the word regionalism that much anymore, they're getting smart. They use the word consolidation. They convince the people, especially in economic downturn times like right now, this tragic time we're going through, that this will save money, that it won't have as high taxes. Consolidate, consolidate, don't do it. We are the major country that's going down to communism, and the rest of the world will follow. They'll call it the global system, the international socialist global system. It is nothing but a totalitarian system. In 2002, the minutes reveal that in 1910, the Carnegie trustees asked themselves this question, quote, is there any way known to man more effective than war to so alter the life of an entire people? For a year, the trustees sought an effective, peaceful method to alter the life of an entire people. But ultimately, they concluded that war was the most effective way to change people. Oh, God. World War I. Horrible war. Oh, God. I mean, made every other war look like nothing. They sent a confidential message to President Wilson insisting that the war not be ended too quickly. After the war, the Carnegie Endowment trustees reasoned that if they could get control, here we go, of education in the United States, they would be able to prevent a return to the way of life as it had been prior to the war. And they recruited the Rockefeller Foundation to assist in such a monumental task. Education should aim at destroying free will so that pupils are thus schooled they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. Influences of the home are obstructive, and in order to condition students, verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. It is for a future scientist to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. End quote.
Young people. These people are taking the private, confidential information of your children.
And amazingly, they're not even trying to hide it.
They're not hiding it. They're not hiding it.
They don't even care that you know. Bill Gates is pretty open and honest about it.
And here's here's Bill Gates. Listen to this.
In terms of standards, the state-led Common Core State Standards Initiative is developing clear, rigorous standards that will match the best in the world. Last month, 46 governors and chief state school officers made a public commitment to embrace those standards. This is encouraging, but identifying common standards is just the starting point.
Right. Listen.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arne Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests.
Think of that, $350 million from stimulus, $200 million now from Gates. I don't know how much from Yahoo.
And Google.
But we're easily at $600 or $700 million right now.
Yeah,
we might be close to $1 billion.
No, it is stunning. And by the way, what Bill Gates is announcing, the White House has in past said that's not true. We're not doing any of that stuff. We're not doing any of that stuff. I mean, everything that he's
Gates
talking about.
Oh, he spills it all here.
Yeah, and listen to what he's about to say.
Next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
Good.
And it will unleash a powerful market of people providing services for better teaching.
Stop. Wait a minute. It will unleash a powerful market for people looking to learn how to teach the children. And so what they're saying here is...
And also, by the way, how to market to these same children.
Right. So but Bill Gates is developing software that will be used in this. That's why he's investing all of this money. Because Microsoft will be able to own and sell all of the software for this particular system. So they've really invested in, let's get this system through, because look how much money we have. A powerful, quote, a powerful new market. Now, can you imagine saying that about anything else? Imagine if McDonald's said...
Or Coke or Pepsi.
Yeah, we've got if we can just get this through, our charitable arm of Coca-Cola has put in all of this stuff in lunchrooms because... it'll be good for the kids to get healthy, but it also will provide us a powerful new market.
This is an amazing moment of honesty from Gates, because normally he would sell this, I would think, in that I really believe in this because
no, I think he does.
Our kids will grow up to be better employees, and they'll be able to work at Microsoft, and we'll have more skilled, trained employees in the future. That's the way I'd be selling it. If I'm investing $200 million.
We have, but see, that's
he's talking about his market.
But that's even more evil, I think. That's even more evil.
First thing I'd like to call on all of you to do after leaving here is to talk to at least 10 people outside of our education bubble to inform them about what is happening, because the mass public, they really don't know what's happening. And what is happening is that education has become a huge trillion-dollar industry. It's being taken over by corporations. And instead of funds going to K-12, going to community colleges, going to UC, going to CSU, they are being outsourced to consultants. Consultants has become a huge industry. So as Steve said, I was a government attorney for the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, and they don't just license teachers, they also license school administrators. They work with the CSU and other institutes of higher education to approve teacher preparation programs and school administrator programs. They monitor those programs. They're supposed to be monitoring proper assignments. And I definitely did see a lot of things. I'm not going to talk about that. There's YouTube videos on that if you choose to watch them. What I am going to talk about today is the problem that I have seen and I am working with other people up in Sacramento, and I have literally seen a very, very ugly pattern of people that are in key political decision-making positions that have aligned themselves or are themselves either lobbyists for corporate clients or are involved some way in making profit for these corporate interests that are involved in the education industry. An example is the Strategic Education Services. They have as their client City College of San Francisco, Santa Monica College, LAUSD, and also Connections Academy, LLC. Connections Academy is the second largest online education company in the country. It's now owned by Pearson. How many of you have heard of Pearson? Okay. Pearson is the large international global testing company. In 2006, in addition to publishing and testing, they went into the assessment business by buying out National Computer Systems. Bill Gorth was the founder of NCS, and so actually if you look up Pearson, it's NCS Pearson, and that's why, because in 2006 they bought National Computer System, and they're headquartered not here in the United States, they're headquartered in London. So that's where their headquarters are, but they have offices all over the world. And they are privatizing, and not just by testing everyone to death, but by assessments. And it's not just teacher evaluations and tying teacher evaluations to student tests. It's data-driven, basically profit-driven data. And they're heavily involved. They have a contract with Stanford University and a company called Achieve Inc. And through the funding by J.P. Morgan Chase, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Lumina Foundation, they designed the Common Core standards. And a lot of people don't realize that. I don't know if many of you know who Lumina Foundation is. Lumina is a very large nonprofit entity, and nonprofits have really entered the field. They're so-called nonprofit, but actually they're essentially funneling a lot of public funds, and they're getting private philanthropy foundations in collaboration with them. They don't pay taxes. Lumina is a conversion foundation. It used to be, I can't remember the name now, USA Corporation, you can Wikipedia it, but they basically, the majority of their assets were student loans. So they sold $1 billion worth of student loan assets when they converted to Lumina to Sallie Mae. And if you look at their board, they have a lot of people in the student loan industry. One interesting thing to note for those of you that are UC folks is Mark Udoff sits on the board. Mark Udoff is the president of UC. He sits on the board of the Lumina Foundation. And so when I say that our public key decision makers are sitting on the boards of these privatization entities, they are. And I don't know how much room we were going to have, but I was going to show you.
No, I was going to take this.
Okay. We have literally connected tons and tons of organizations. We're putting them into databases and connecting the dots, both at the state level and at the national level, of how many of our government officials, and when I say government officials, I'm not just saying senators and assembly member and our governor, I'm also saying city council members, school board members. How many of you know of EdVoice? EdVoice? Okay, EdVoice is a top campaign contributor in the state of California. It was founded by then Assembly member Ted Lambert and former Insurance Commissioner Steve Poizner. On the board used to sit, I don't know if he's still on there, Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix. He also sits on the board of Facebook. He also sits on the board of the California Charter School Association. He is heavily involved. He's heavily involved in Rocket Ship Learning. Rocket Ship Learning uses this IT entity called Dreambox for their interactive model. Basically, the IT world has infiltrated into the education industry, and they are just coming up with ideas by the minute on how they can produce data, how they can produce tests, how they can assess student performance. It's really, they're outsourcing to just numerous organizations. How many of you have heard of the organization WestEd? Okay. When we hear about the fact that we have a budget crisis, of course that needs to be questioned after recently you probably read in the paper that $2 billion has been found. WestEd is an organization which is considered a public agency, and yet numerous school districts, county office of eds, and numerous foundations such as Gates, J.P. Morgan, Lumina, all these entities are funding WestEd. So if we did away with all these nonprofits and all these so-called consultants and lobbyists who literally have conflicts with people that are sitting, there are actually active lobbyists sitting on elected school boards when they represent clients such as K-12 Inc. and rocket ship learning. That's actually happening, but no one's doing anything about it. And so I propose to you, and I have been at a number of events now, that we need to build a statewide coalition. We can't attack everything. This is happening worldwide, it's certainly happening nationwide, but we need to build a statewide coalition so we have a group of people ready to go to do our own ballot initiative.
In the spring of 2010, the federal government required cash-strapped states to sign on to the Common Core standards in order to qualify for over $4.35 billion in race-to-the-top stimulus funds. The deadline was such that the states had to accept Common Core sight unseen. Now the standards are out, and it's clear that the latest educational fad is nothing more than a race to the middle. There is a better way to educate our kids. It is a method of education that has produced some of the greatest minds in the history of the Western world. That method is classical education.
A bit about another kind of education. Whether we're successful in stopping the implementation of Common Core, or if it fails of its own accord, and it will fail, we must be in a position to offer a better alternative than simply a return to the previous misguided system. It's not enough to simply go back to what we had. As such, I'm here this evening to talk about classical education. That may be a term that you're not real familiar with, and hopefully after my time with you this evening, you have at least a rudimentary understanding of what we mean by classical education. I'd like to pause briefly before we begin our topic to acknowledge and to say thanks to Dr. Terrence Moore at Hillsdale College, who's allowed me to borrow liberally from one of his articles for my presentation this evening. So thank you to Dr. Moore. Classical education has a history of over 2,500 years in the Western world. It began in Greece. It was adopted by the Romans. It faltered after the fall of Rome. It made a slow but steady recovery during the Middle Ages, and was again brought to perfection during the Italian Renaissance. The classical system of education passed to England, and from there to America through colonial settlement. At the time of our nation's founding, classical education was a thriving system. Thomas Jefferson, arguably the most learned of our founders, recommended classical learning and recommended Greek and Latin as a basis for education. The founders routinely referenced classics like Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans in both their formal and their daily conversation. Americans venerated George Washington, largely because he exhibited the virtues associated with the Roman patriot Cincinnatus. So important has been classical education in the West that one could say the march of civilization has been directly tied to the vibrancy of classical schools. With that said, I think we have to ask the following question. We have to ask, what was it about this system of education that so captivated and shaped the Western world? In answering that question, there are really four components or four central tenets to the system, and I'll share those with you briefly. First, classical education is a system of education that values knowledge for its own sake. Second, it upholds the standards of correctness, logic, beauty, weightiness, and truth, all intrinsic to the liberal arts. Thirdly, classical education demands moral virtue of its adherents or followers. And then lastly or fourthly, it prepares human beings to assume their place as responsible citizens in the political order. Let's go through these one by one. I said first, it's a system of education that values knowledge for its own sake. In doing so, it represents a break from modern theories of education that seek schooling merely as preparation for adult work. Or in the case of the latest fad in education, and here of course I'm talking about Common Core, proponents cite as their goal making students both college and career ready. The classical view of education is quite different. It begins with the premise that humans are thinking creatures, that we are innately curious, that we have within us a desire to know objective truth. We see this curiosity in children as soon as they begin to speak, when the first question is always, what is it? Children demonstrate what is true of all people. We are natural learners. Therefore, any plan of education should take advantage of people's natural curiosity. Classroom theories that stall children in their learning because they are not, quote, ready for it, or because it's not, quote, age appropriate, or by teaching to the slowest learner in the class are not only counterproductive, but they're also insulting to the human mind. Contrary to what future teachers learn in progressive university education classes, knowledge does not come to the student unaided from nature. Children need explicit instruction to understand the world around them. They have the tools, but they need the direction. Every child has at his or her disposal a veritable arsenal of mental capabilities, including memory, reason, imagination, a sense of beauty, and a facility for language. Classical education, unlike many of the modern theories, does not simply leave children to their own mental urges or inclinations. Rather, it feeds and directs. It strengthens children's mental capabilities in the same way that sports aid in physical development. The focus on rigorous mental training is an important difference between classical education and modern progressive education. So classical education puts young minds to work. It leads young people to understand themselves and the world around them. One of the benefits of this approach is the development of what is known as cultural literacy. Coined by retired Yale University professor E.D. Hirsch, the term cultural literacy refers to that reservoir of common facts, ideas, and references that a people must possess if they're to communicate effectively. How many of us have thrown up our hands in frustration at the state of our American politics? It seems we have two parties who are simply talking past each other rather than engaging in meaningful debate. The answer is that they are speaking different languages because our public schools have failed for several generations to effectively transmit a certain level of cultural literacy, in effect leaving us without a common language. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, I think, is a terrific example of how cultural literacy works. We're all familiar with the words. 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln's audience understood when the president spoke of a proposition that all men are created equal, he was referencing the Declaration of Independence. There was a common understanding between the speaker and his audience. He did not need to retell the story of the Revolution. Because the audience had a certain level of cultural literacy, Lincoln was able to make one of the most powerful speeches in history in just 270 words. Sadly, that same speech would not have the same meaning today. Some critics may say, however, that classical education, by promoting a sense of cultural literacy, is dedicated merely to ornamental trivia. It's designed to create Jeopardy champions, is what you sometimes hear from critics. This is, of course, not true. As we are sadly learning today, only a culturally literate nation can live up to the demands placed upon it by history and the present condition of the world. Only a culturally literate individual can comprehend and navigate the vast areas of human knowledge essential to the political, economic, and moral well-being. The second component of a program of classical education is that it upholds the standards of correctness, logic, beauty, weightiness, and truth, intrinsic, as I said, to all of the liberal arts. In other words, in addition to requiring young people to know certain things, a classical education also teaches them to make judgments according to certain standards. To be classical means to uphold a standard of excellence. The classical works of Greece and Rome are not simply great because they are old. They are great because they employ harmonious language to depict remarkable human events and to explain the transcendent ideals of human existence. The study of language provides the best example, I think. Everyone can talk. Most people can read and write at a functional level. But classical education requires more than simply functional literacy. It teaches students high standards of grammar, precision in word choice, and eloquence based in a love for language. As part of a classical education, students are exposed to the highest examples of eloquence, attained by the greatest writers and greatest speakers in our history. This is important because there is a difference between using Shakespeare and a more modern Dick and Jane type children's book to teach grammar. I'm not suggesting that all modern resources are bad. Rather, I recognize that by using the classics, we can kill not 2, but 3 birds with one stone. By preferring Shakespeare to an anonymous Dick and Jane book, we teach grammar, we teach cultural literacy, and we teach beauty of language all at the same time. This is important because young people are desperately in need of standards of thought and of real beauty. For many modern young people, their speech ranges from the sloppy to the vulgar. Those persons whose only expressions of approval and disapproval are, "That's cool," or "That sucks," lacks not only a descriptive vocabulary, but also the ability to judge events according to their nature and their gravity. Rather than seeking to meet a state-imposed common standard, those who embrace a classical education agree with the motto of Winston Churchill, "I shall be satisfied with the very best." The third component of a program of classical education is that it demands moral virtue of its adherents. This is essential because education is first a moral enterprise. Schools can approach the moral development of students in one of 3 ways. They can ignore moral issues altogether. They can open up moral questions for students to explore in a, quote, non-judgmental or non-committal environment, or they can teach classical views of self-command using traditional teaching methods. Methods 1 and 2 are most often the approaches used in the public schools. One only needs to pick up the newspaper or turn on the television to see the outcome of this sort of so-called character development. In the classical curriculum, there's room for teaching virtue without a particular denominational bent. Unlike the typically modern classroom where students endlessly discuss the supposedly equally valid solutions to a moral problem, in the classical classroom, students are confronted with the great stories of self-command and self-sacrifice found in literature and in history. These stories show that actions have consequences and that there's a clear difference between right and wrong. Rather than encouraging young people to emulate the virtues of their pop culture idols, classical education teaches them to emulate the moral virtues of heroes and heroines. The final component, or fourth component, of a program of classical education is preparing human beings to assume their place as responsible citizens in the political order. Classical education has always been concerned with the political order and with the formation of true community. Our American founders understood that political wisdom and virtue does not come easy. They must be cultivated. More than 2 centuries of American history have confirmed that this nation can only be sustained by citizens who understand, serve, and defend our founding principles. Our founders, as much as they embraced liberty, We're deeply concerned about the unchecked passions of a poorly educated public. In light of this concern, a classical education offers the best instruction in our nation's founding principles. Students will learn that married with each right they enjoy as Americans is a corresponding responsibility. This education can best be done through a thorough study of American history and government, consisting principally in the reading of primary sources. Only by this method can students be prepared to take their place as defenders of the American inheritance. Let me conclude with this. Contrary to what you would hear from some of the critics of classical education, it is far from arcane or dull or unimaginative. Rather, the classical view understands that a human being without knowledge of the past, without reverence for his cultural inheritance, and without a judgment formed by the standards of true greatness is much like a man with amnesia. He knows not who he is or where he comes from. He knows neither his rights nor his duties. He understands neither his debts nor his debtors. Worse still, he's likely to become the pawn of another. Americans should support the notion of classical education, not only because of its centuries-long track record of success, but also because the progressive educational system has failed time and time again. It has failed to provide our young people with the cultural, moral, and civic literacy to live a productive and happy life. It fails them today. It fails them with a one-size-fits-all, top-down, servile system of education known as Common Core. It fails to recognize our most basic human desires. Rather than wishing to become automatons programmed solely for the world of work, young people have an innate longing to know the good, the beautiful, and the true. It's about time we once again begin serving that need. It's about time we consider the benefits of classical education. Thank you. Thank you.
In our search for a school for our children, I discovered classical education. And the more I read, the more I became convinced that this is the best way to educate kids. Not only is it time-tested, but it's experiencing a resurgence today as educators search for more effective ways to teach kids. Let me tell you my story. This is a picture of my husband Peter and our 4 children, ages 28 to 18. When they were young, like every parent, we searched for the best school for our kids. We tried a public school with an excellent reputation. We tried a private college prep program that was also well known. And we even tried religious denominational schools. And in most cases, we just found that our kids weren't being academically challenged. And they weren't receiving the values that we thought were so important for them to learn. It was very frustrating. Well, it turns out our frustration was warranted. If you look at how American students are compared to the rest of the world, you may be very surprised. Of 34 developed, our students are performing only 14th in reading, 17th in science, and abysmal 25th in math. Remember, this is out of only 34 developed countries. These are appalling results. And on the values front, things aren't any better. Some of you may recognize this young woman. Her name is Hadia Pendleton. She was the unfortunate victim of a fatal shooting in Chicago just a few months ago. In a newspaper article that covered the story, a Reverend Michael Flagger, who was actually at the funeral, was quoted as asking, "When did we lose our soul?" Clearly, he was asking, how in this society have we become so filled with violence that we've practically lost our humanity, our soul? Well, it was that same frustration with a lack of values and the fact that our kids weren't being academically challenged that caused us to keep searching for other school options. As I did that, I came across an ad for a school that had opened in Rochester just a few years earlier. I read the synopsis of that school, and I knew in an instant that's exactly what we were looking for. So I contacted the school and I said, "Are there any schools like this in the Twin Cities?" And they said, "None that we know of, but this school was started by 6 families, and you can do it too." What? Start a school? That was the furthest thing from my mind. But you know what? We were so hungry for this type of education that against all odds, that's exactly what we did. We started a classical school. So you may be wondering, what is classical education anyway? Well, let me tell you. It involves 3 stages of learning. The grammar stage in the lower school, where we focus on the tools of the subject. The logic phase in the middle school, where we focus on understanding of the topic. And the rhetoric phase in the high school, where we focus on application and communication. All of these stages integrate beautifully with a child's natural progression of cognitive development. Let's start by looking at the grammar stage. In the grammar stage, kids are, developmentally speaking, able to memorize information very easily. They're like sponges. Those of you who are parents know, at this age, the kids will watch the same movie over and over, they'll read the same book over and over, and they never get tired of it. So what you do is you pack as much information as we can into songs, chants, rhymes, sound-offs, things they don't mind repeating over and over. We add actions to make them even more engaging, and the kids are having so much fun that they hardly even... We're able to teach the students the chemical elements through a song, parts of speech and how to diagram sentences through chants. It's amazing what they can learn using this method. And another part of classical education is that we teach using the classics, beginning in the grammar stage. They've stood the test of time. They have all the wisdom of the ages, and they're so full of rich content that the kids love reading them. Also, we teach cursive writing in the grammar stage because of all the well-documented cognitive benefits. And Latin is begun in the grammar stage. Latin forms the foundation of all the Romance languages, and approximately 65% of the English language is based upon Latin. So students who know Latin tend to perform much better on standardized tests down the road, and more importantly, they can learn modern foreign languages easily. And also history is an important part, where we teach it from ancient all the way through modern, sequentially multiple times throughout the 12 years of an education. And we focus on using the primary documents rather than textbooks, so that the students are actually reading what the people themselves had to think and say at the time. Now let's look at the logic phase. The logic phase is marked by kids who are becoming much more argumentative. They want to know how, and they want to know why. If you're a parent, so what we do is we again capture where they're at. And now we introduce formal research. We do compare-contrast exercises. They write from the perspective of historical and literary figures. Any activity that gets the students to develop a deep understanding of the subject they're learning, because that's the goal at the logic phase. We give them formal logic class where they learn the art of argumentation, how to develop a formal argument, a reasoned argument, how to recognize logical fallacies. And then they can practice these in debates. They begin doing a lot of debate in the middle school years. Also, writing becomes very important during the logic phase. We teach the students the process of how to write, and that gets emphasized all the way through their senior high years. Then, the rhetoric phase. The rhetoric phase is marked by kids, developmentally speaking, who are becoming independent. They're forming their own opinions, and they're starting to separate from their families. So now, once again, we're going to take advantage of where they're at. Now, not only do we want them to know the tools of the subject and then understand that subject, now we want them to analyze and synthesize the information, form their own opinions, and then communicate those opinions in an effective and persuasive manner. This is what we call the crown jewel of a classical education, because it's the culmination of everything that we've worked towards. The students are given lots of opportunities for deep discussion, where they can practice those analysis and synthesis ideas. They can also practice their debate skills and learn to develop arguments that are based upon reason. Then they're given 2 years of formal rhetoric training, where they learn the art of writing and speaking articulately and persuasively. Most important with a classical education is that the students learn how to learn. And what about from a values perspective? Well, historically, a classical education has addressed both the mind and the soul. At our school, we nurture the soul through Judeo-Christian values and beliefs. While we don't require our students to be Christian, we do want to make sure they understand that's the perspective that we're teaching from. And then we expose them to all the other faith traditions, and that way they are able to understand the other viewpoints in the world. Well, let me tell you our results. Our students are performing well on every standardized test, but most of you are familiar with the ACTs and the SATs as our college entrance exams. Our students are performing in the top 13% of the nation on the ACTs, and they're performing in the top 17% of the nation in the SATs. And I want you to know that we are not just taking cream of the crop children. We're taking students who are average and beyond and achieving these kinds of results with this method. And you can imagine they're being offered great scholarships as a result. Approximately $30,000 per student per year of college. But even more important than that is these children are learning how to become deep thinkers. They're learning how to speak persuasively and articulately. They're learning how to reason logically, and they're learning how to write well. Have, as I said, learned how to learn. And other tangible benefits that we're seeing is the kids have learned to develop respect for others, including those who have opposing values and beliefs. And they're internalizing their values so that they have a guide for moral decision making. They're becoming responsible, accountable, putting the focus off of themselves onto others. And they have developed the strength of character to act compassionately. Well, with these results, I finally had peace concerning my children's education. Not only was I no longer frustrated, I was excited to be able to share this method with others. So I'd like you to imagine with me for a moment, what would it be like if everyone in our culture had a classical education? And I mean, imagine this. From the hallways of Washington, D.C., to our nation's media outlets, to our school systems, to our communities, and into our neighborhoods, what would it be like? Imagine citizens who know their history so well, so deeply, that we are less likely to repeat the mistakes of the past. Imagine citizens who base their opinion upon reason rather than emotion, and who recognize logical fallacies so they're not so easily deceived and manipulated. Imagine citizens being able to express their thoughts and ideas in an articulate and persuasive manner. And imagine respectful, as opposed to just denigrating those with whom we disagree. Wouldn't this just be a pleasant change of scenery across all of these different realms of social interaction? Well, with this in mind, could it be possible that we'd all be better off with a classical education?